but it's just so good to see these faces.
I know, right?
Everyone joining.
When I got your email, I was like, oh, yay, she's doing it. Well, thank you.
Well, we have been just having morning coffee while we waited for everyone to join in. I am going to start officially with the very first equity brief. And this is, of course, a response to the time that we're in. We were talking as we were setting up this morning about how we are all adapting and changing and responding. And this is a critical time, unlike any other in our lives, in such a time of opportunity. And so when we thought about continuing our equity work for the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce, what we thought about was, how can we have a conversation about innovation through an equity lens? Because what we're really hearing from business leaders is that life as we know it will never be the same. And we have entered into a new season. It is a season of opportunity, but it also has some challenges. And we're also seeing grave disparities. And we're seeing some true feelings about members of our community. And there's an opportunity for all of us as champions of equity to be on the forefront and really make sure as we plan for our next, that we plan for all to have an opportunity to succeed. So with that, I just again want to welcome you to the equity brief. We feel it's important that you guys have a chance to talk. So we're going to have a presentation and then we're going to break out to breakout rooms. I am going to need a facilitator for one of the sessions. So if anybody wants to volunteer, please let us know as we get there. But first, this work is not possible without our sponsors. And so we want to recognize Bremer Bank, who is our presenting sponsor. And while we are virtual, we are still grateful for the Science Museum of Minnesota as our venue sponsor and for their work. We have corporate sponsors who are, the program sponsor. I was waiting for that slide to move forward. Bush Foundation, which is powering our work. And our corporate sponsors are Anderson Corporation, Anchor Paper, Flint Hills Resources, Land of Lakes, Mille Lacs Corporate Ventures, Redpath and Company, Travelers, and Excel Energy. Our contributing sponsors are Sunrise Banks and St. Thomas, University of St. Thomas. And we appreciate all of our sponsors for being with us and making this work possible. So we are in great hands this morning. We have Anika Ward, who is the founder and principal of Sankofa Leadership Network. She kicked off our equity series in March and did a fantastic job, and she will be our moderator for our online work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anika. And thank you so much, Anika, for being here with us. And again, thank all of you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Shannon. Again, this is Anika Ward with Sankofa Leadership Network, and our work is advancing equity-centered leadership for systems change, which is why I continue to be grateful to have been invited to support these discussions. This is an important dialogue. This time last month, we all gathered together in person at the Science Museum for the Equity Series. And we began a conversation that is really continuing to elevate in this time right now. And so much has changed since that time that we came together. And yet, obviously, as we process through these solutions around equity or around this, our new realities connected to this pandemic, so much is clearly the same. And so it's important for us to be having these conversations. I'm sending my best to all of you who are joining us today, to your organizations and to your loved ones as you move through and develop and create your new normals as well. In March, we were provided a lot of just really incredible context by Juhi Pompoon, Nick Aum, Allison Liuzzi, talking about the many levers that are available to us within our organizations to advance systems change, or without intention, without being very intentional about it. We've talked about the ways that we can impact and create new inequities within our systems just by the way we hire, the way we create jobs, the way we, who we contract with, how we contract, et cetera. We talked about how we can unconsciously or consciously create cues and signals for others within our organization and around us about whether or not this is a space where you can bring your full self, where you can be who you are and bring your full self and creativity to the table. We talked about the importance of tracking and watching statewide data and trends to inform our work, to inform how our work is helping to support building equity within our region. And also we talked about the opportunities that this data can show us for improving our work and building statewide initiatives and networks for change. And Lissa reminded us about how many of the inequities that we're talking about right now were actually intentionally built in and baked into our organizations, into our culture, into our laws within the United States, and how important it is, like redlining, issues like redlining, and how important it is because we know that came where we are is a result of great intention, how important it is for us to be extremely strategic about how we undo that work, undo systemic and structural injustices. And so obviously, as we talk about moving through this journey together, it's important to remember that we don't build systems change. We don't change these systems. We don't change outcomes without a strong network. And so the purpose of this work and this conversation that we all have together is to build that network, continue that conversation, make sure that we're exercising our ability to discuss this and build solutions together. We spoke a lot about connections. And so this is a continuation of that work. I want to finally remind us that when we spoke last month, we talked about the fact that it's important that this is a new conversation. It's important that although we've been involved in a lot of these discussions before, this conversation, we are all committing to leaving differently and to showing up and thinking about the power, the role, and the responsibility that we each have to change these systems and to create more equitable outcomes. And so we want to change and we want to leave this space doing something different. I am so thrilled to introduce our speaker for this morning, who will talk about the 4 frames of leadership that are important in moving forward and bringing about equity. Miss Lissa Jones is the host of Black Market Reads, which is a podcast of the Givens Foundation for African American Literature. She's also creator and host for Urban Agenda on KMOJ Radio. And without further ado, Miss Lissa.
I love this group.
Sorry.
Good morning.
Couldn't help it.
Bless you, Shannon. Hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm really delighted to be back with you on this equity brief. It's exciting to me to be here. I want to share a few thoughts with you. There are 2 men by the name of Bowman and Deal who are big in the field of organization development. And they have come up with, many years ago, what they qualified as 4 frames of leadership, 4 ways of intentionally thinking about how we lead. So the first part of my presentation quotes Toni Morrison. Before you enter a position, or I should say, as you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think. Many of us go right to one of the frames that Bowman and Deal talk about in leadership, which is a structural frame. It's the idea that we have to go into a position thinking about all the tactical things that are required for a plan. What are we going to do? And Toni Morrison is reminding us that in positions of trust and power, dreams are necessary. Anika, when she was opening this morning, reminded us that systems won't change and outcomes won't change unless we dream a little and perhaps maybe stop overthinking a lot of the things. Next slide, please. Thank you kindly. Bowman and Deal talk about leadership in 4 ways. They talk about structural. They talk about it in frames. The structural frame focuses on tactics. How are we going to get from point A to point B? If you have people who you're working with or people who are working in your organization who don't understand the tactical way to get from point A to point B, there'll be a great deal of confusion and likely dissension and probably risking not meeting the goal. When a leader is looking from what they call human resources frame, we are prioritizing the needs of the people. The needs of the human beings in the organization is sort of the lead, the way we're thinking about framing what we're going to do next. When it's political, that is actually politics. It's about who gets what and how much. These are times in the political frame when agendas tend not to necessarily align. People are coalition building and they're moving for power. And that can be a very good thing in an organization, but if it's not managed effectively, it can be a very disastrous and dangerous approach if not used well. Finally, Bowman and Deal talk about a fourth frame. It's called the symbolic frame. This is where you appeal to meaning. What the Queen of England did just a while ago when she used a World War II song to sort of say, we will meet again. We will see one another again. We will bring meaning back to our lives again. She was really using a symbolic frame, a way of saying to people, this virus is so threatening that what I'm going to bring to you is a meaning of life, a way of approaching it. The United States is using a much more political approach, as are many other countries. What Bowman and Deal argue is that a leader, being intentional about our leadership, ought to be thinking about the things that are in front of us through these four frames. How are we going to do it tactically? How are the people involved? Because the people have to be there to get it done. What agendas are present in the work? And how do we find meaning as leaders to bring that forward, to unite people, to make them desire to do the work that really needs to be done? Next slide, please. What if inclusion and equity are the innovations for the next century? What happens if the things we have been so intentionally avoiding, so intentionally creating no space for, what if they are the actual ways to innovate into the new decade? What we recognize, what I'm kind of struck by, is that Anika was talking about the fact we'd only been together 30 days or so ago. And I was thinking about the fact that COVID-19 was still pretty new to me at that time. And how I was talking with you about the price of exclusion. And I think to myself, the lack of healthcare in this country, the intentional ways that people are categorized into health disparities, these things are very, very serious and now threaten the health of everyone in the world. So what I said last month became even truer this month, in the sense that we have to be responsible as leaders to change the paradigm, or the threat to everyone is serious and severe. So I put in inclusion and equity in this slide to make them verbs rather than nouns. Siri thinks she's talking to me. Please forgive me. I don't know why she continues to come on. Forgive me, Siri, you're not in the class. Nonetheless, thank you. Next slide. Deloitte and Touche came up with what they call 6 signatures of effective leadership. They're talking about culturally competent leaders who will be able to lead into the next century. They're talking about leaders who practice inclusion as a way of being in the world. In one case, they talk about cognizance. They say, because bias is a leader's Achilles heel, I need to know first where I'm at on things, people, places, issues in the organization, how I really feel about them. For example, the way we feel in America, and I say this as a gross generalization, I'm not putting this on you personally, but the way we feel in America about viruses and epidemics is we tend to racialize them. Most recently, the COVID virus was racialized as the yellow epidemic, the Chinese virus. That comes from an 1822 act called the Chinese Exclusion Act, where though there were only 0.002% of the people in this territory were Chinese, the United States Congress passed the Exclusion Act because Americans decided that they thought Chinese workers were taking their jobs, and they began to racialize the idea that wages were being lowered because Chinese people were Chinese. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And now in 2020, our feelings about people being Chinese are coming back in very vengeful and terrible xenophobic ways. We have to be cognizant of our input so we can be aware of the potential for our output. Curiosity. We have to be curious to bring different ideas, perspectives, and people to the organization, particularly ones that do not align with ourselves, if we really wish to innovate. There's too much group thinking in business, and what we found is that our business is not going to be done the same way, and probably not offered exactly the same to the same people. So we're gonna have to get increasingly curious to find out what other people are thinking and doing outside of our comfort zone, outside of our standard context. Cultural intelligence becomes very, very critical. They talk about the idea at Deloitte that not everybody sees the world through the same lens. I'm an American, I'm an African American, and the way I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, and the way I see the world is not the same as the way everyone else sees the world. And the assumption that everybody sees the world in the same way makes us make very serious cultural mistakes, or by intention and by design, mistakes which will cost us later, like health disparities. Good leaders understand that collaboration is the requirement. Nobody makes it on their own unless they're lying to themselves. Nobody pulls themselves up by their invisible bootstraps. We talked about this last time. It will require a meeting of great minds to solve the problems we have. As you can see, as we can all see, this virus has caused national or international collaboration in science to try to figure out what to do about this. It's caused international collaboration alongside gross nationalism, but international collaboration amongst governments to figure out how to cooperate and collaborate to figure out what to do. So that's going to be a necessary continuation of innovation. Commitment. If people don't feel committed and they don't feel like you're committed to them or to the cause, they're going to go all kinds of ways from Sunday. So it's going to be necessary that the leader demonstrates an unwavering commitment, that our discussion matches our action. So we don't talk about inclusion, we actually practice it. We don't talk about inclusion in great ways about how wonderful it is and everything without talking about how challenging it is. We don't talk about putting inclusion in our organizations and then threaten the health of that work by not allowing people to have space to really talk about what's working and not working in that way. Commitment is a verb. And finally, courage. When I was prepping with Anika and Shannon for this discussion, I was talking about the idea that if you've ever lacked courage to do something brave, use the coronavirus to your advantage as an innovation. We must get closer to equity because we recognize that Dr. King said we are tied in an inescapable network of mutuality. What affects one directly inevitably affects the other indirectly. And we have to recognize that now we're talking about a health pandemic that is now also an economic epidemic, or a pandemic potentially. And that is going to draw the world together in a very different way of necessity, if not by design. So if you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. Innovation is a successful exploitation of new ideas. What is old is new again. We must become cognizant of what we grew up with, what we believe about the value of people, and we must decide whether or not those things need to change in order to really innovate for the next century, in order to figure out how we're going to stay relevant and what's going to happen. So I think that this time, albeit it's sad and terrifying and uncertain in so many ways, is also ripe for innovation. We aren't going to go to school in the same way. We aren't meeting in the same ways. I don't know if we'll ever be back in a stadium celebrating sports in exactly the same ways. But we know some principles in business are true. First to market owns the market. And if you can figure out how to innovate in this time using equity and inclusion as your primary lenses, as your primary goals, you can actually transform your business and what happens in this world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lissa. That is extraordinary advice and direction in the work that we're doing. And in this time, reminding us of the price of exclusion is something we need to think about on a daily basis. A lot of times we go into our work and we think about the price and the cost of inclusion because it requires us to work a little bit differently and think a little bit differently. But what's the price of exclusion? That should be the conversation that we're having. And thank you for the reminder of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the fact that, again, these things continue to come up and remind us about the ways that we have intentionally, our structures have been intentionally built in a way that excludes, and now we're suffering some of those costs of exclusion. You also reminded us of and I hope that everybody had a chance to document those. I think you gave us the four frameworks, but then you also talked about kind of the markers of successful leaders, that cognizance, that curiosity, the cultural intelligence, the importance of the ability to engage in a collaborative way, commitment, obviously. Commitment means that we go into this work and we know, again, when we think about the cost, we think of what the cost of not acting is. And then finally, courage. You know, we have to do our own personal work to to bring that, the type of courage and the level of courage that's needed to move into this. So thank you so very much. I know we are moving into right now at this point, our breakout conversations, and I want to thank our 3 facilitators from the Twin Cities Diversity Roundtable. I know that Tanya Hampton, Philomena Satter, and Colette Campbell are our 3 facilitators. They will move each of the groups into questions. We will have about 15 minutes. Each individual in the discussion will be directly moved into a room, and they will have a facilitator that will lead their discussion. And then at the end, we'll ask you each to report out very briefly about the conversation that you've had so that we all can benefit from the discussion. The 2 questions that we'll ask you to consider are, number 1, we know that there are so many ways that in this trauma, in this space, in this new normal that we're creating, businesses and organizations are being forced to rethink everything about the way they do business. And as they try to rethink that, it's really important that they recognize who's being left out and adjust for that. And so we're seeing some really exciting innovations start to happen that are really encouraging about what it's going to mean when we come out of this. And so we want to ask you to think, 1, about in what ways are you seeing organizations innovate in some creative and awesome, with some creative and awesome outcomes. And then number 2 question is, how will that change how you show up? What will you do differently? What can you do differently within your organizations, within your communities to innovate as well? So those are the 2 questions we're going to be asking you to consider, and we'll be back in about 15 minutes. Thank you. Hello, this is Anika. I think you can all see me. We have come to a close of our group breakouts, and it is time for us to do group report outs. I want to thank our facilitators, Tanya, Philomena, and Colette from the Twin Cities Diversity Roundtable. I also want to thank you all for your conversations. I know this was extremely brief, and we had two really great questions that we wanted people to move through. And so you didn't have enough time to go into the type of detail in many ways that we want to go into, but this conversation was intended to be a kickoff for your discussions and to help inspire you, help you think about how you might go back into your organizations and innovate, because now is the time. We know that you're going, as Lisa said earlier, we are going to have new opportunities and new expectations to be innovative and creative and create solutions for all people, not just 40, 50% of people. And so hopefully you got some inspirations today. I'm going to ask each of the group leaders to start report outs at this time. Thank you.
Do you want me to go first, or only because you said my name first? It doesn't have to be me. This is Tanya.
Tanya, yes, please. Thank you so much.
All right, fabulous. I was paying attention to a pattern and I didn't know if that was the one I should pay attention to, but I'm here. So super delighted. And I will have to say that we didn't get all the way through the second question and ended off with Leah saying her precious words. So Leah, I hope that you were able to write down what you were thinking so that you don't lose your idea, since you weren't able to say it out loud. And in terms of our first response, our question that we had around how are organizations being innovative in this time, that's sort of my own personal reword. But the themes that came out of that was that, you know, organizations have this sort of tone of being empathetic. And one way that that shows up is they're being super employee friendly and supporting their employees during this time and doing their best that they can to keep them employed and care for them. And so hopefully that's something that gets carried forward as an empathetic gesture to employee bases. The other thing we talked about is that there is this freeing up of people being able to work remotely in jobs that we didn't think that we could have work remote. And so there's this idea of trying to continue down that path and instill the sort of the muscle within organizations to do that and continue to gain trust between employees and leaders. There was also some theme around organizations pivoting and changing their business model. One example that came up was Chow Girls Catering took the rest of their food that they had coming in and actually gave it to Second Harvest. So there was both a giving back to an organization and reducing of waste. Yes, absolutely. Very, very cool. And then we talked about how the value of work is being challenged. And the idea that there are many different jobs right now that we need to step back and actually have better value wrapped around them. Our teachers that are now at home working remotely and the kids that are with their parents. That's something that some parents, frankly, never imagined and never thought they would be in their situation where they're caring both for their children and also trying to do their job. And so there's a rethink about how we think about teachers and the true value of what they provide. And perhaps there's a different way that we can reward and recognize them. I'll end off with saying that there are similar structural things as it relates to low income individuals and the impact that is happening there. There is less access to get IDs, less access to get other paperwork finished. And so just imagine if you're someone that never had that before. And so it's really impacting people who don't have access in the first place. And now it's sort of tripled that. The next question that we got into, the one thing that we were able to start to talk about is that an example of an organization that used to do some gender discussions with their teams, and they are doing that still in their remote space. And I got a sense that when COVID is over and this sort of umbrella has removed itself, there's still going to be some cloud, and organizations like the one that was mentioned at the end that's doing the gender discussions will still continue to do them, both remotely and in their organization. So that too is an example of continuing on in the new way, the new normal, right? So that's what we talked about. It was a great delight to be with the team that I was with. And so thank you for the opportunity and the honor.
Great.
Thank you. Colette, thank you.
Okay. So thanks. I think a lot of what Tanya said really resonated with our team. The very first question about how our organization's being innovative. For the folks I don't think we got to hear from everybody, but some of the common themes we heard is that, you know, this obviously has been a disruptor, and it's been a disruptor that has made people have to think differently. And in that thinking differently, there's been lots of positive things that are happening. Some of the folks on our call worked with young people who were trying to find employment, in particular internships. And so how that experience, folks that are these young people or young professionals that are in organizations, instead of just severing their employment or furloughing, organizations have tried to figure out how do we keep them working, which was very hopeful, because thinking about the summer, I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is that that's going to be different. A lot of places are actually having to reconsider whether or not they're going to have it. So, but we also heard on the call that organizations are trying to figure out how do they continue to do the good work that they do, particularly YWCA Minneapolis. Ruben was talking about the in his work of doing cultural training, cultural competency training or diversity training. How do they change their format of having face-to-face and have it virtual, but have the same impact? And so organizations, I think, again, the common theme that I was hearing from folks is just, how do we continue to do the work and have the same impact, but in a different way? And then thinking about how people will do things differently. Again, every organization is being challenged with that. And so some interesting things, but also one big thing is how do we, from the mindset, how do we, the folks that have already been challenged, that are already underrepresented, that are already under-resourced, how is this situation not only, you know, not only keeping them where they're at, but is it negatively entrenching them into a harsher place? And that's just a hard thing to sit with, to kind of figure out. Yeah, so people are just trying to think about how to do things differently. There was an architect who spoke and talked about how this is even making them mindful of the spaces that they're creating and the spaces that we're in and that we have been in. Do those spaces work for us anymore? And so how is that going to help innovate the future of space? I'll stop there.
Thank you, Colette. Philomena.
All right, I'm the closer, and my two colleagues have put some really good information forward. So I'm going to try not to be duplicative. We had a great conversation and representation and voices from business, government, nonprofit, secondary ed, and so a lot of different perspectives were brought up. But one of the things that I think was really important and powerful for us to think about from an education perspective, whether it's secondary ed or elementary or middle school, is that digital divide. So with distance learning, what is the impact of that? And on families where technology could be a barrier. And so we had Metro State talked about all the different ways that they're supporting their students during this time. And many students are in need of food, so keeping their food bank open, access to technology, which I thought was really powerful. So a number of different organizations are talking about how do we make sure that we are inclusive and not leaving anyone behind. The other thing that I think was a powerful message, and I think this was Rebecca Olson, she talked about, as leaders, the importance of we can't do everything, and letting go and giving your team voice and empowerment to come up with ideas and solutions and not feeling like we have to do it all. And I thought that was just a powerful reminder. And then we talked about too now, you know, how do we best utilize all these new tools that are available and educate? so that people are prepared or know how to use it? Or, hey, we're going to use cameras today, so you might want to shower. And so, some really good conversation with our team. So thank you.
Yeah. I have one point that I forgot. I have it circled here 3 times. It's one of those things where you have it obviously circled 3 times and I forgot to talk about it. One point that somebody said was investing in relationships. Our face-to-face contact, our daily, that is so important. And it's also so important to invest in relationships. And so how are we're seeing that that's really important to do now. That's causing, I think, something that's putting forefront for organizations. How do we continue to do that? Because if we don't have trust, we can't do good work. So sorry, I just forgot to add that.
That's good.
Excellent one.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the 3 of you and for everyone in this conversation for sharing your time with us this morning. We just have a couple more things as we wrap up. I'd like to acknowledge and appreciate the tone of the discussions we've had all day. I was in Colette's group, and yes, there was this really important discussion that someone brought up about the importance of relationships right now. And I think that has been something I felt even through this discussion. And as we planned with Shannon and the group for today's program, the tones of the discussion that I felt are, one, there is a feeling of uncertainty. However, there's a lot of hopefulness, and that word came up at least a couple of times in our discussion. There are organizations and people who are doing their best to keep their ear to the ground and be helpful and supportive and responsive. There's a discussion, someone in our group brought up about the conversations about parenting and the balance between being a parent and navigating your children's education from home as you do both at the same time, and this new appreciation for educators. And then the sense that we are entering this incredibly new normal that we don't know what it looks like until we've created it, but that we're all working together to create this new normal. Most of all, for me, I'm really excited about, although we're in this very difficult space, I'm really motivated and inspired by this feeling of humanness. I think we are in a space where we're all recognizing and acknowledging each other as human beings first, in a way that I haven't heard happen consistently in meetings that I've had before. But this first acknowledging that we're all in a tough time and that we're human beings that are trying to manage work and children sometimes together. And so, I want to thank Lissa for the conversation about the price of exclusion. What we heard in our discussions today very much was this recognition that there are so many people who have been excluded from resource that now we are paying that price. And there's a lot of folks in our group that we're thinking about, but okay, what if the fact that young people might not have summer jobs or college students might not have internships, what if that creates greater impact? And what's our role in addressing that? And so there've been so many important conversations. And finally, I want to remind us about the conversations and bring that back, the conversation about intentionality, the importance of vision in this work. There's a lot of folks that are afraid, and as leaders, taking from Lissa's conversation about the 4 frames and how important it is to be intentional about how we access and engage in those 4 frames, and how important it is that we represent and that we show up as leaders with some intentionality. It's important that we remind ourselves to inspire ourselves, to find out what's happening, to tune in and stay inspired and empowered so you can empower others around you. And we must have a vision. So now is the time for us to create new and exciting visions. And we've got a lot of opportunities. We have seen already within our schools reframing and reorganizing, redirecting resources in new and creative ways to make sure young people are fed, to make sure young people have access to technology so that they can get their education. And within colleges, we heard this morning, within universities, to make sure that they restructure internship experiences for young people. We know that institutions like banking institutions are actually reworking how they do business so that people can get services from their home, not just on their computer, But by calling in, I actually had the most amazing experience with my bank, working through my business account and adding a second business account. And it was more simple than ever before. I've heard from folks in human services that the Ramsey County, for example, is rewiring all of its services so that they can support people from their homes in ways that people have probably asked for years or wanted to have happen for years. So instead of people having to go from building to building and setting new appointments for each service they need, they're connecting services and providing more supportive services. And so hopefully this means that we come out of this space in a better place, better prepared to support people and to create structures and systems that lead to equity. So I'm thankful for that. It's important to me to remember what things I am thankful for and grateful for and optimistic and hopeful about, even as we move through this difficult time. I know that Shannon is going to come on next and say a few things as we close out. So thank you all. I look forward to joining with you on the next time we have this discussion.
Thank you, Anika. Appreciate you greatly. Want to thank Lisa for framing our discussion and providing context. There's never enough time for Lisa to share what she knows. I love how she is able to distill so many things down to a quick soundbite and takeaway for us. Want to thank our facilitators, Tanya, Colette, and Philomena. Appreciate you greatly for your leadership in this space. But I really want to take a moment just to thank all of you who participated. This was an effort to continue the dialogue. We want to do more of these, but really want to make sure that you have a chance to feel plugged in and have a chance to have your say, if you will. So would love your feedback. I sensed as we were in the breakouts that we could have spent a lot more time there. And the beautiful thing about this work is that all of you are experts in your own right and your own view, and having more time for us to share together could make a tremendous difference in what we're creating here. So the commitment going forward is that we'll have more room and time in breakouts so that you can share. The opportunity before us has been stated clearly. It's about putting equity into action and thinking about how right now we can help make some decisions for our organizations and ourselves so that we continue to move forward from an equity lens and have an impact on the lives of many and make our organization stronger and swifter. It has been said over and over again. I believe that the innovation that's happening, it's like being pent up and wanting to be able to jump out and really have a chance to make some big, bold moves, but we were forced to do so. And as we continue to push forward, there will be many opportunities to be more inclusive, more innovative, and just more agile and nimble and responsive to how people need to engage and how we can leverage the resources around us. So ask that you think about that. I would like us to continue the conversation through the LinkedIn group. If you are not a member, just go to SPAC Equity via LinkedIn and we will add you in, but please share your thoughts after this discussion. And again, email me directly at Shannon, CHANNON, at stpaulchamber.com, and want your feedback and hope you will join us next time. So all of you are champions, all of you are leaders, hoping that we can join together to put equity into action. And last but not least, want to thank Faith and Evie for their continued support behind the scenes and helping SPAC move into this new realm of Zoom meeting. So thank you all.
Thank
you all very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Shannon.
you.
Yes,
Thank you, Shannon.
Woo!
Well done.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Have a good one, everyone.
Yeah.
All
Bye,
right,
everyone.